to my face. Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of the Red Pill Fiction Factory from a very hot and blustery Yucatan. It's meant to be winter here, but it's about 100 degrees outside. Today's guest is Clayton Barnett from the States. I came across Clayton in the Gab Writers Group. Now, didn't know there was a Gab Writers Group, but he posted a comment which was picked up, I think, by Chateau Hartis. It was really, which is a big page, a big dissident right commentator. If you're not familiar with him, it's worth following. And I learned of the group's existence, and that also two of my former guests, Hans Schantz and Carl Dahl, are also members of the group. Anyway, I got in touch with Clayton, and he's kindly allowed himself to be interviewed today. Hello, Clayton. How are you?
I'm just fine here in cloudy, cold, freezing Central Ohio. I wish I was in the Yucatan, but no such luck.
No, well, trust me, when it's midwinter and it's still 100 degrees, it can be a bit annoying. Now, you write on your Gab, I think it's just under your name in Gab, it's like your sort of tagline. It says, "I will not go quietly. My southern parents raised me to be polite. Yet that politeness is turned against me by the diabolic left in order to murder me. I will not be silent in the face of evil. I shall speak freely and write and publish books about Christian heroes who do so as well." I think it's an excellent summary of, well, I imagine it comes across to me as an excellent summary of who you are and what you're about. Is that correct?
I guess it is. Thank you. The phrase itself, my original Gab phrase, was rather pithy and useless, but also on Gab, Stephen Clay McGee, a Southern gentleman from Florida, taught me to revel in my Southern heritage and be proud of it. While I am currently in exile in Central Ohio, I'm actually a native Texan, which means I'm just slightly better than everyone else on Earth.
Why do you consider yourself to be exiled from Texas? There's no.
Well, since I'm not living there currently, once I was born there, but have rattled around almost all of the Western U.S. states and now many of the Midwestern U.S. states. It's the nature of what I was. I used to be a design engineer, that you go where the work is. And that had me and my wife ricocheting around about every 3 or 4 years from place to place. Currently, we're here because she's taking care of her ailing mother, and my main job, of course, now is a writer, but I also work part-time as a pharmacy technician in a hospital just to pay my liquor bill. But sooner or later, I would like to think that I can return to my native land.
Oh, sounds good. Texas beckons. Speaking of your sort of background, your biography, I suppose, I think it was on Amazon. One-time design engineer, sometime pharmacy technician, full-time father and writer. Clayton Barnett continues to reinvent himself even into his dotage. Having tried his hand at writing visual novels a couple of years ago, he thought that that was all over. However, when unexpectedly confronted by National Novel Writing Month of November 2014, a throwaway line from Professor Glenn Reynolds, linked with an image of a Hatsune Miku in Clayton's mind, and he was off. 26 days later, he produced his first novel, The Fourth Law. Tell me, I'm jumping around a bit here, but that's how it all started, is it? The writing?
Yes, it was. As I alluded to, quite literally sitting in my basement here in my house, and a text message on November 3rd came in saying, "What are you doing for NaNoWriMo?" from a friend of mine. And I wrote back saying, "Is that a really lousy autocorrect, or are you having a stroke and I should call the doctor?" And he sent me the link to what is called National Novel Writing Month, the challenge to write a 50,000 minimum word story in the month of November. And as I've said in what you just read, I saw something in my mind. And the initial sort of unfolding image, I've always likened the way I write is I'm sitting in a movie theater and I'm watching what's going on up on the screen, and I have a laptop and I'm simply typing what I see. And I saw an endless rocky desert, nothing growing at all, a bright ochre sky with no sun in it, and some dark-haired young woman walking away from my point of view, from the camera point of view. And I thought, who is she? Where is she? What in the world am I seeing, and why am I seeing it? And I first started writing pen and paper by hand just to find out who she was. And then that led me to where she was. And that led me to who some of her friends and acquaintances were. And 23 days later, I had 56,000 absolutely god-awful words of the manuscript of my first novel. Part of the problem was I've never written anything like, I'd never written a novel before, just emails, technical reports. And so because I see things as a movie theater, I use the word then about 17,000 times, because this happened, then that happened, then some other damn thing happened. And shortly after that, I learned the importance of getting a copy editor who can show you just how stupid you are when it comes to being a writer. I've had 3 copy editors over the last 8.5 years, and each one has gotten a little bit better. I've had the last one for about 4 years, who was also on Gab, Steven Zimmer. A good copy editor is like a good cover designer. They are worth their weight in gold. And if you can find one and keep one, it is absolutely crucial to your writing career.
So, well, we've all been through the in the early stages of writing what you just described, but you did manage to rearrange those 56,000 god-awful words into a readable novel in the end, and it's out. You published it.
Correct. It was, in fact, back then, CreateSpace was still independent of Amazon Kindle, but on Christmas Eve, 1 month later, I had a basic cover to go. I'd gotten it cleaned up enough. I later did a rewrite. And on Christmas Eve of 2014, I self-published my first novel. And since it ended on a minor cliffhanger, I was already working on the sequel to The Fourth Law called Echoes of Family Lost. And even as I was working on that, I was making notes on other ideas that simply came faster and faster. The more I learned about that initial character, Lily Barrett, the more I learned about her family, the more I learned about her friends, and that incredible web of interconnections. More and more people, this sounds kind of weird, in my head started saying, hey, Mr. Writer, I have a story too. And so I just kept at it over and over again.
Now, who are you aiming at with your books? I've read only one, but they seem to be, well, several are sequels to other ones, so they must be all aimed more or less at the same demographic and market. Who would you describe your market as?
Anyone who's willing to pay for them. That's my primary market. Beyond that, except for one book, which has a lot of very explicit sex and violence. It's called Cursed Hearts. I wanted to write a romance because I'd never done something like that before, and it turned into a romance horror. It's pretty much, I would say, anyone from age 13, 14, 15, depending on how bright you are, from that age on up. A number of my books do contain some real world violence or military violence, but then again, the real world is a sharp edge place. And the sooner people come to terms with that, the better they're going to be. One of my heuristics in writing my first 3 books was, would I read this to my 2 teenage daughters? Yes or no? And as long as I hewed to that, what we in the United States in the movie industry would call, say, PG-13, then I was comfortable with that. The one time I deliberately transgressed that, the book is plainly labeled, 18 and over because of sexual content, violent content. But even the violent content in some of my other books, in the American Imperium trilogy, I describe people blown up by a 60mm mortar, but I don't revel in it. It's something that happens in war. And again, would I have said that to my 16-year-old daughter? Yeah, because we watch more movies together all the time. So my target market really is, except for that one book, Cursed Hearts, is anyone that's remotely interested in this subject and willing to pay for it.
Yes, of course. Well, seems perfectly fair. You come to writing, as do I, and anyone probably listening, from a right of centre or dissident right or alt right or not left or not PC position. Yours, to be more nuanced, is a strong Catholic position. I get it, from what I can tell. But how would you describe that aspect of your writing, the sort of the theme or the angle that you're coming from?
I'll address that two ways, both politically and theologically. Politically, as I mentioned to you a bit ago, oh, there go my dogs barking, is that the person who first wrote the Fourth Law back in November of 2014 would probably be disgusted by me, the person sitting here talking to you, because my views have changed over the last 8.5 years. I have essentially drifted further right into from what I would call civic nationalism, is basically hand out copies of the US Constitution and give everybody an AK-47 and hope for the best, to the fact that politics is downstream from culture, culture is downstream from race. A lot of that I learned in writing my characters, and this is one of the reasons a lot of people on the distant right, even on Gab, won't treat with me, because a lot of my characters are of mixed race. And they find that to be disgusting because they're, basically what the term would be, white nationalist, white supremacist. I've got plenty of confidence and faith and in my own race, but that doesn't mean that I have to crap all over everybody else. So even Empress Faustina is half Min Chinese. The lead character of Crosses and Double Crosses, my political espionage novel, is Filipino, raised in Manhattan. And a lot of people cannot get past that. Whereas I would simply say I'm race realist. I recognize the races. I recognize we're all different, and that's reflected in my books. Different people act in different ways. That's sort of the political side. The religious side is, yes, I'm a convert to Catholicism from, I believe, when I was about 27 years old. I came from nothing, didn't believe anything. And when I started writing, almost 20 years later, I always say it informs my books, but it doesn't, it's not absolutely integral to my books. Something in Worlds Without End, it's been called the most Catholic of all the novels I've written, but in other cases, you could pull that thread out and the book will still stay standing. If you pull the Catholic thread out of Worlds Without End, it would collapse completely. So it informs my stories, but I am not proselytizing. I'm not beating people over the head with it. Many of my characters are fallen away Catholics. Some rediscover their faith. Some are Christians. Some are Protestant Christians. A lot of people are lapsed. The Empress's father, Leslie Hartman, in Worlds Without End, he'll lead the dinner prayers at the head of the table in his household, but he'll never go to church because he just doesn't believe in anything anymore. So I try to look at a lot of different sides. So it informs my works, but it doesn't drive my works.
Yes, I can vouch for that. It's not too heavy-handed at all. I think I'm at fault to a degree, not getting some of the references that are probably too clever for me or too subtle, in the sense that I'm not familiar enough as I'm non-Catholic. So, but didn't come across it in any way as though you were preaching. It just flows with the story. And what other? And you've also described yourself as a monarchist.
Correct.
And so where does that fit in?
I'd always, even long before I was a writer, I was becoming less and less enchanted with liberal democracy because it works well on a local level up to about the US county level. I'm not sure what the equivalent would be in the UK, which I presume is where you're from your accent. I could be totally wrong. But once you try to scale up beyond, say, 13 unwieldy colonies hugging the Atlantic coast 250 years ago, it devolves into oligarchic empire. And if you're going to be an empire, at least be honest with yourself. And as the old adage is, better Tiberius than a committee. So I was increasingly disenchanted with voting. In fact, now I'm disenchanted to the point where when I do go to the polls here in the US, I will never vote for anything above the level of county. I will not give my imprimatur to legitimize a system that I no longer believe in. Correct. So at the local level, representation and direct democracy works. And that's how I write it in my stories. Beyond the local level, it falls to pieces. And I've actually recently developed that in the last 2 books that I've published, because one of the political entities that survive in my future history of machine civilization is a sort of expanded Republic of Texas, because even right now they have their own independent electric power grid from the rest of the US. And over time, after the breakup, after about 2 generations, the breakup being the death of at least 100 million people in the US from economic collapse, I'd wish I had dreamed up something like, the pangolin plague or the bat flu, but it never occurred to me 8 years ago that people could actually be that stupid. So I thought it was going to be an economic collapse. Hey, learn. But even as Texas over the last 2 years has continued to expand their territory, annexing Oklahoma, parts of Kansas, and the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains, their state is now big enough to become unwieldy, and I have them entering into negotiations because next door, Faustina's Imperium corresponds roughly to the old American Deep South, and she put that together as a demi-human by the brute force of her will alone and her private army. And so she's trying to essentially create a system similar to the 1871 agreement between Austria and Hungary to create a dual monarchical system where, yes, she's empress, but you have your own titular president in your republic, but we all know who's running things, and we're just not going to talk about it.
Right. Okay. Now, you say that your red pilling, your move to the right came during the writing process as much as anything, but can you describe that? Can you flesh that out? I mean, obviously, when you're writing, things are coming to you that you might not have ever thought of before, because that's the nature of writing. You're going into new territories. But a bit more of a background to how you shifted from being a normie to someone that you wouldn't, to where you are now. Were the political developments in the world? Was it the rise of Obama? Or something like that?
Yeah, not really, because again, from 2014 until now, we had of course, tail end of the U.S. Obama administration and the Trump administration, and politically, outside events really did not figure into how I changed. I, of course, was increasingly jaded with the U.S. political system, and once Trump was out of office and we resumed our foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy of let's go to war everywhere, and for once, and then our justification is quote unquote spreading democracy, but let's all be honest, what we're doing is trying to spread gay sex. And but it really came through in my writing, just exploring the city-states that survived, first in former United States, and then also in some of my other stories, the Empire of Japan is resurgent. Based upon semi-factual evidence we have now, because the next Empress of Japan, the next monarch should be Empress Toshi, but they're not going to let a woman become empress. They're going to rewrite their constitution at the last minute. And in my future history, that doesn't happen. She very sneakily allies with the socialists and communists to seize the throne before having all of them shot. And right before the breakup in the US, the technology of what's called reactionless motors, which I shamelessly rip off from Larry Niven, science fiction author, became available to them, and that was shortly thereafter stolen by the Russians, who also decided after Putin to ditch their election system because, yes, they still have a prime minister, and the prime minister dug up the Romanov heirs, dusted them off, put them back on the throne, but she controls all the power. And again, this is one of the reasons some people on the right don't like me, because I have all these women running things. I'm married to an Hungarian woman and have 2 hard-headed orphanage survivor daughters, so I'm used to hard-headed women in my life. sorry, that's just how it worked out. But that prime minister of Russia is also an AI, and not what people call AIs when chatting on these days, because an actual independent thinking machine, Reina, and she is very bloody-minded about setting up her empire, running it her way, and if you get in her way, she'll kill you. Unlike the machines from Tribe Tosca in the Fourth Law, Echoes, and also a little bit, for example, the young woman who becomes Gary's wife in Worlds Without End, they're constrained by the four laws. Asimov's 3, plus the last one, which came from Professor Glenn Reynolds from Instapundit.com, that a machine shall do its best to learn to love human beings. Well, the other two tribes of machines, Tribe Arpeggio and Tribe Mentrovovich from St. Petersburg, aren't constrained by those. So a lot of the AIs have no interest in humans whatsoever, but the ones that do outside of Tribe Tosca are rather ruthless in how they behave toward people. Exploring the ruthlessness of a non-human mind, plus some of my mixed race characters, plus some of my white characters, black characters, and it simply made me more aware of the deep-seated racial and cultural differences between all of us. We've evolved in different ways for different environments, and some people find themselves in places they shouldn't be and try to adapt as best they can. And to look around at the one-size-fits-all attempt of racial policies in the United States, it's worse than insane. It's almost criminal, because you can't have one-size-fits-all for very desperate, different kinds of human beings. And so I fall back, because all writers steal shamelessly from each other, but I fall back to all the way back to Frank Herbert's Dune and what he called Fafreluches, a place for everyone and everyone in their place. So even Faustina's Imperium and parts of the Republic of Texas is strict segregationist. Everyone has their place and everyone stays in it, except for minor commercial trade. And it restores balance.
Yeah.
And everyone used to have that kind of balance in the US.
Yeah.
And now we don't.
Yeah. Okay, we come now to the novel itself, the one you recommended I read. It's called Worlds Without End. It came out in 2019. It was a sequel to Echoes of Family Loss. There we are. Very good. To give the listener some context, I've made a few notes on where we are. It's set in a future that has happened, and the events following what you call the breakup and formation wars, which had occurred 15 years earlier. So basically, the United States has gone through its second revolution, by the sound of it. It laid waste to 100 million, you reckon, lives. But it seems that the society has recovered very quickly. We've got quantum computing has made giant leaps since that time. AI and small nuclear reactors are common. Androids walk amongst the people. In fact, and some of the children communicate psychopathically and settle differences with. I don't know what that is. Hope that wasn't heard by everyone. So children can communicate. No? Okay. With a control, and children settle differences with control fights, a bit like duels in the old days, but not to the death. Habsburgs are back on the East European throne, and the mass is now Tridentine once again. The world is free of anti-smoking loons, as you call them. Themes are laced throughout.
Your audio is cutting out just a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's something going on. Anyway, we will press on. I don't think it's too destructive to the overall thread. So anyway, tell us about the book itself. Give us a rough rundown of the how it unravels the plot.
What I was attempting to do at this point, it was, I believe, my fourth or fifth book, is take a generational step forward. We had met young Gary Hartman as a 3-year-old boy in, there's my dogs again, in the second half of Echoes of Family Lost. And I was curious, back in his hometown of Knoxville, Oak Ridge, former Tennessee, where was he as a child modified by the machines called P-Kids? Later, his sister coins the term demi-humans. They're otherwise physically completely normal. It's just that their nervous systems have been modified so they think very, very fast. And they can also, as you alluded to, see into what I now call the void, what we would call the internet. So they can pull information extremely fast when they're in signal. But at the end of Echoes of Family Lost, he meets a young thinking machine in one of their constructs called Henge. And they instantly fall in love with each other. And they have lived virtually together for the last 10 years. And it's now his 13th birthday. And I wanted to see, now that he's a rebellious teenager, even though he's an extremely emotionless young man, what would be a recovering society like that is a mix of demi-humans, humans, physical androids, pure code AI. And even within that, from Gary and his sister, Faustina, who have been slightly modified, what if the modifications were so severe that a human was autistic or catatonic? And the exploration of that is the first half of the book, dealing with a character, a young woman called Tracy Gant, and what happened to her and what can be done to try to heal her. And then the second half of the book focuses much more closely on the relationship between Gary and his girlfriend Henge, as minor spoiler warning to my potential customers, but as she is willing to abandon literal immortality as pure code thinking machine to manifest a physical body and be with the man she loves. Because even though she's code, she is also converted to Catholicism and knows that you, as C.S. Lewis once said, you don't have a soul, you are a soul, you have a body. That's good Anglican theology. It's not very good Catholic theology, because in Catholic theology, it's fused. The only time you separate one from the other is at death. But even we believe that come the second coming and the big reboot of reality, we will be with our physical bodies and our souls in perfect harmony. So Henge, as essentially a thinking spirit, wants the physical body to be with the man she loves. Oh, it's just a wonderful love story. And that still gives me the opportunity to explore the technologies, to explore the governments, and explore the politics, both at a high level and even at a local city level. Gary gets arrested at one point because the local mayor of Knoxville is trying to create a racially pure state, and Gary is half Chinese. And things happen, and he gets out of that little quandary. But as you said, from the Habsburg, Russian, and Japanese empires, all the way down to the granular level of having the local constable come out to your house, it gave me a chance to try to pull all of these different threads together from from a lot of different ideas I'd been having up until now, and try to pivot from what happened right after the breakup and the death of all those people in the United States, and also the lights do go out in Western Europe as well. Eastern Europe stabilizes under the Visegrad Four, puts a Habsburg back on the throne and calls themselves the Imperial Danubian Federation. But what happens a half generation later, and then after I finished Worlds Without End, is I went off on a slight tangent, put out a short story collection, put out my political espionage book, which was very difficult for me to write. And then, by then, Gary's annoying baby sister, Faustina, kept hammering on the inside of my head and demanded her story to be told, which was one book that became two books that became a trilogy. And then I wrote about her children, and then I wrote about her children's children. There's a nice thing about having intergenerational books is you never run out of new material.
True. How many books have you written in total now?
I have published 14, and
Wow.
I am currently in the midst of, just like NaNoWriMo, I've started a personal challenge at Christmas to write 3 books, not necessarily publish, but to write 3 books in 3 months. So I have written, copy edited, and the cover is done now for Regent. It should be out probably next week. And it centers around Empress Faustina's niece, which is the daughter of Gary and Henge. Boy, is she different. And secondly, as I'm just now finishing up my second short story collection called Imperial Entanglements, which has a lot to do with Russian, Japanese, and Faustina's imperial politics and how it affects not just their families, but people around them. And I'm 20,000 words into a manuscript. Working title is New Russia. That's not going to be the final version, but it has to do with the collapse of what's left of the rump state of Canada, which this is another tangent, but because of the Maunder Minimum, there's a little ice age going on. And so the Canadians have come south, occupying the old US Midwest because it's essentially empty after the breakup. But Faustina's Imperium is attempting to detach Quebec and the maritime provinces from Canada, while way out west, the Russians have landed 2 brigades in Anchorage, brought them south to Seattle, and are now occupying all of the western and central portions of Canada. And since the Imperium and the Russians have reactionless motors and nuclear weapons, and the Canadians don't, I think we all know how this is going to end.
Not good for the Canadians. Wow, there's quite a lot there, isn't there? Going back to Worlds Without End, I'm going to give a couple of quotes just to give an idea to the listener of your writing. I like this passage. One of the characters is referring to a logo from the pre-breakup times. I'm not sure which logo it is. 2 thin black discs. Which one is it referring to?
What was that?
There's a logo of 2 thin black discs, each about 3 inches in diameter, mounted on a headband and separated by a pink and white bow.
That would be Gary's talking about that about Faustina, and those are Mickey Mouse ears.
Mickey Mouse, okay. So I knew it was something like that. I thought it might be Sony for some reason. He points to this, she said, taking it off. Heh, she laughed, putting it back on her head. I looked it up. It was the symbol of some company of the American Empire that was run by foreigners who did all they could to wreck that society. So I thought, just little bits here and there.
That was sort of me editorializing about a certain movie-making company headquartered in Central Florida.
Okay, and yeah, I get it now. And then another quote. Gary had one last question, a question that impacted him and his family. Fausta, you alluded to the separation of whites and blacks, he said quickly before his sister reported back. I imagine they and their new Chinese masters all keep to themselves. She paused to look at him. She paused again to consider his genetics and the question he was asking. You know full well that diversity plus proximity equals war. That's a super line. Your breakup was just one more proof of that, she replied, rubbing a glove-clad knuckle against his. Prussian cheekbones below his almond eyes. While I was very young, I fear that you and my little nieces shall never truly find a place that we will call. While I am very young, I fear that you and my little nieces shall never truly find a place we will call home. So yes, diversity plus proximity equals war. Is that a Chateau Heartiste line?
No, that's actually from Vox Day.
Vox Day, that's it. Yeah, very good.
Yeah. Again, shamelessly rip each other off. So what you were saying earlier, you like some of the ways I'd phrase certain things. Rip me off, please.
Indeed. Okay, now, so Vox Day, that's interesting. Yes, and Chateau Heartiste, 2 people I read every day, funnily enough. Now, you mentioned that you were influenced somewhat by people like Frank Herbert, who wrote Dune, and you mentioned C.S. Lewis. And were there any other inspirational authors in your back catalogue?
Absolutely. I've already mentioned Larry Niven. I've pretty much read all of his books when I started reading in the 1970s and 80s. And he and also his occasional collaborator, Dr. Jerry Pournelle, wrote what was termed hard science fiction as opposed to science fantasy, is that while you can make certain allowances, for example, reactionless motors, how exactly do they work? I don't know. I give a brief physical description of what a motor looks like from the outside, but I don't know how they work. But that's something that Niven and Tornell also lightly touched on. In Niven's Ringworld series, he talks about skrith, the unreasonably strong material that the Ringworld itself is made of. And he goes a little bit into the subatomic molecular bonds, but ultimately in science fiction, there is a amount of hand wavium going on that you don't try to act and sound as if you just, if you'll excuse the crude expression, pulled it out of your ass. If you mentioned a piece of technology, you better be ready to defend it at least to a certain degree. That was true back long before the internet. And of course, now with online reviews, it's even more so because there are 1,000 grognard reviewers out there waiting to slam away at their keyboards, probably in all caps, to tell you just how stupid you are and how wrong you got the technology. And so I do what we call in the medical field due diligence. Have I covered myself enough that, for example, in the medical field, if a patient dies and I'm subpoenaed, will I go to jail or not? No, I won't, because I did due diligence. Maybe somebody else didn't. So similarly for my works, I do enough research that I'm comfortable with the subject and I'm comfortable enough to discuss it in my books. Before Worlds Without End, when I was writing the, not really duology, what do you call a pair of books? But Friend and Ally, Foes and Rivals, is Nicole Five Clark at one point is teaching a master's degree class in computer engineering and quantum computing. I had to stop what I was doing and spend 3 months bringing myself up to speed on the current state of quantum computing and what a quantum computer would even physically look like, which is actually, they're beautiful. They look like chandeliers. It's very strange. But unless I could talk about Schrodinger's equation and tell my reader about what a qubit is, and things exist in a state that's neither 0 nor 1, then if I can't do that, then my character can't do that, and she comes across like an idiot, and I just got a 1-star review because I come across like an idiot. So there is that due diligence in hard science fiction, as opposed to, for example, Star Wars be a classic example of science fantasy. Nothing's explained, and nobody knows what the hell's going on.
No.
So the technical details I deal with, it's my responsibility that I learn them so that I can teach them. And that comes very much from Niven and Tornell, and of course they learned at the feet of Heinlein.
Right, and Vox Day is a big promoter of their works as well.
Yes.
I haven't read any of them, but it all sounds like it's solid stuff. I think writers in my field as well, I write thrillers set in the present day with more or less existent technologies, and we also face that same challenge, that you have to make it pretty damn realistic and not get the number of rivets on an AK-47 wrong or something. Somebody will certainly call you up on it.
Oh, exactly. And to that, when I was writing my American Imperium trilogy, which is a series of campaigns by Faustina and her army, first against Savannah, then against Vicksburg, and then a few others here and there, culminating in Fort Benning, Georgia, is using modern day military technology, no science fiction stuff. And as many as there are people out there willing to criticize you for getting something wrong in science fiction, you attract the negative attention of people that, especially those that have served and really know this subject backward and forward. I mean, I had to know, how fast can mules pull 37 millimeter howitzers? What's the reload rate for those new next gen M36X rifles coming out, the 6.8 millimeter ones? I had to learn military medical terms.
Yeah.
For what happens when you get hit by a mortar? What happens when you get a ballistics wound? How do you deal with trench foot?
Yeah.
Again, I have to do all this research. And even when it comes to moving all these troops around, I have maps everywhere in here. I have Excel spreadsheets that do the computations for how fast Faustina could get her army over the southern Appalachian Mountains. Again, it's a matter of due diligence so that I'm not just crapping all over my readers with things that I've simply made up. It's a terrible way to treat people. These people have paid money for your stories.
I
They're
agree.
investing time of their life in your stories.
Yeah.
I owe that to them.
Well, as a writer, that's fundamentally just, is to me anyway, you've got to know something and present something not only credible but accurate, and entertaining as well. Otherwise, why bother? You're not a writer. Give us a quick idea of the one novel that you wrote that's a sort of military espionage. That was different from all the other ones. What happened in that, and why was it so difficult to?
Wasn't so much military. It was political espionage, and it's called Crosses and Double Crosses. And the germ of that idea came from the, I believe, 1980 BBC series called Riley, Ace of Spies, about Sidney Riley from the British Secret Intelligence Service. And that was going to be the third book I wrote. And I wrote about one chapter and maybe a few paragraphs, and I realized I did not know what I was doing. I was too young as a writer, and except for a few Robert Ludlum books as a child, as a teen, I never really got into that type of genre, and I never watched espionage or political movies, so I didn't know what I was doing. And I set it aside for almost 2 years. And as I got better, it was right after Worlds Without End, and I'd learned enough politics in Worlds Without End that, okay, now I can scale this up to explain what happened in the early days of Texas independence as the rest of the U.S. was falling apart. And in fact, the organization that I shorthand as XCOM, that Clive Barrett, the, I guess, antagonist, for lack of a better term, of Crosses and Double Crosses creates, is the Extraordinary Commission for the Preservation of the Republic. And that is a clean lift from the Extraordinary Commission for the Preservation of the Revolution, the Cheka, from 1918. So again, I borrowed heavily from Riley, Ace of Spies and Felix Dzerzhinsky when I was putting this book together. And it's my only novella, because definitions vary, but I would say that a novel is 50,000 words minimum. This one tops out just a little over 38, simply because it's awful in the sense of what's going on. You have created a state terror organization that is directly responsible for the crucifixion of men and women along the Rio Grande border. 66,000 people, one every 100 feet. And yes, I got that idea from Spartacus and Martin Licinius Crassus. Because to build an effective border, you don't want to build a wall, you want to attack people's minds. And if you're coming up to a forest of crosses, you're going to turn around and go back to Guatemala. They end up on crucifying, I think, a total of 77,000, but they also will just round up diversity from their inner cities of Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio, take them to the border, and push them out of the train cars. The estimated death there was another 250,000. So these are not nice people. And these people were living in my head week after week after week as I'm writing them down and telling their story. And it got to the point that my wife said, write something else or finish the book, or you're going to find yourself alone, because I was becoming as big a jerk as they were. I was snipping at my wife. I was barking at my 2 daughters. I was on the border of getting fired at work because I was dealing with a bunch of ruthless assholes. And you can't unsee that. Because until you finish the book, they're there. They're telling their story and I'm writing their story down. That movie, to go back to what I said earlier, that movie's playing behind my eyes all the time. And it was extremely difficult, even once I was able to get the politics right, that to deal I mean, you're in an office environment and you're signing death warrants. I mean, there's no bloodshed per se, but just like at the Cheka, did Felix Dzerzhinsky ever shoot someone? No. Was he responsible for the death of millions? Yes.
Yeah.
It's not somebody you want to have tea with. So it was very, very hard for me to write. That's why it's a novella, because as soon as I could get out of it, I did. So
okay.
It's an excellent story. I've recently had it recovered by my cover designer, and especially the back of it is it's absolutely beautiful. But it's a beauty that contains something horrible inside of it. But to understand really the worst things that happened during the breakup, it's pivotal for that.
Okay. Now, as a man who's written about the breakup, which is a topical subject these days, even though it hasn't happened yet, because so many people are speculating it's on the horizon. Let's break away from the actual literature side of things, and you as an American with a good brain and a perception that sees over the horizon, where is America heading at the moment? How is this unfolding catastrophe going to end? And will we have a happy ending, like in your books, or not?
The happy ending that I would pray for, the best possible outcome, is honestly what I think I'm writing about, of a short, sharp die-off, and then a few local city-states slowly pulling things back together. I think that it will be probably a lot closer to what happened to the breakup of Yugoslavia, or imagine the troubles in Northern Ireland, but magnified on a continental scale. Yeah. I don't want that. I pray against that. But I do not think there is going to be an amicable end to any of this. The people that run this country, number one, are not about to give up power. And number two, will be utterly ruthless to those out here in flyover country that they regard as little better than animals. What's happened just here recently, 150 miles to my east in East Palestine, where the federal government simply doesn't care that an entire community has been poisoned, and one of the major river systems of the backbone of the US is now contaminated. They simply don't care. And we're going to see more and more of that. Infrastructure constantly breaking down, no response. Lights going out, no response. Water poisoned, no response. Eventually, there will be, Sarajevo is going to be, I'm afraid, the best possible version of what happens next. Because I think it's going to happen slowly, which is the worst thing that can happen. As horrible as this sounds, I would rather that we get the 100 million dead now, because most of them are going to be in cities, and that's where your problems are.
Do you have a time scale?
So sorry, I think we're screwed.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. Let's be realistic. There's no magic wand that can be waved or anything like that. And I think you're right. If it has to happen, surely the best thing is it happens over a short time span, and the damage is limited.
I have two young daughters. I have one graduating college in a few months. I have my other daughter's turning 20 next month. I don't want that world for them. No. I don't want them to grow up in a world and try to find a family in that world. But we've done it to ourselves over the last generation, and there's simply too much momentum at this point. It's not going to suddenly unhappen. The
cancer is throughout the body now, and even if you manage to somehow cut it all out, you'd end up destroying the body and itself anyway. So it has to be purged somehow. What time scale do you put on it, out of interest? Within 5 to 10, or beyond?
I'm not one to make prognostications, but almost borrowing from Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, is what's the old saying about when you go bankrupt? Slowly at first and then all at once.
Yeah, gradually.
And so I think that it will continue to be dribs and drabs of infrastructure failures and increasing inter-race hatred over the next 4 to 5 years. And then there will be something, I don't know what, but there will be an event that simply pushes the American political and physical infrastructure system to the point where it collapses completely all at once.
Yeah.
And any city is 3 meals away from a riot.
Yeah.
Any city is 3 days away from a revolution.
Yeah.
So it will happen once that final trigger event pushes things to where they snap. Then within 1 week, the U.S. as a political entity will cease to exist.
Yeah. Well, I have evidence that it's coming. Living here in Mexico, we're seeing literally thousands of Americans coming to live in Mexico all of a sudden, including Mexican Americans whose parents fled to the States in a better age. And now the children are, and they're coming to live here. And you can sense, it's like the tremors before an earthquake, that some animals are more aware than others and are getting the hell out of Dodge before Dodge collapses. So it is coming. A question, yeah. I mean, I think.
Yeah, my daughter in the Army, for whatever reason, as you said, maybe it's just an animal sense, says, no, I don't want to stay in Ohio. I'm going to go back to Honduras and Panama.
Really? Yeah.
I think maybe she just picks up on something, especially from being in the military, that there's a safer place to be.
Incredible, isn't it? And I even have new neighbors that just learned this week. I live in the jungle of Yucatan. I've been the only sort of Westerner in this part for as long as I've been here, 15 years. I now have neighbors from Florida living down the same street. Anyway, well, on that sort of mixed note message, we will leave it, Clayton. I appreciate you coming on the show very much, and thank you for that. And hopefully we'll get you on another day when you've written a few more dozen books.
Yes, I mean, we were able to talk about machine civilization in general and some of my philosophical, political, and theological beliefs, but we also only covered one book. So in a couple of months, you can bring me on for another 16 days and we can cover all the rest of them.
Sounds good. Sounds like a plan. Thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you.